I'm joined now by Dr. Vincent Carroll, who is a GP, but he also has a higher education in public health, and he also is a fellow of the Royal College of Tropical Medicine. Dr. Carroll, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Now, one of your key interests, of course, is cancer, and you're involved in A or C cancer. You might explain what that is.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for asking that question. I'm chairman of ARC Cancer Support, and we have 3 houses in Dublin, and we offer a range of services, mainly complementary services to people and their carers who are living with cancer. Eccles Street, South Circular Road, and now beside St. Vincent's Hospital. And we work very much hand in glove with the outpatient departments, but we've gone virtual now as a result of the COVID lockdown.
Sure.
Obviously. So we're not just seeing the people we ought to be seeing.
Now, Dr. Carroll, I want to talk to you about cancer because you have an expertise in that area, and lots of our guests are talking about COVID and so on. But the Cork Examiner had an article in which they said that 300,000 cancer checks had been lost because of the pandemic. What does that mean for the future of people who may have cancer or may in fact contract cancer in the near future?
Well, that's an enormously important question, simply because it is possibly going to have a disastrous effect. Our own Irish Cancer Society had a submission to the Oireachtas, and the language they used is very interesting. They said that the secondary deaths potentially due to COVID will dwarf the number of deaths caused by COVID. And that use of language, to dwarf, implies to me that there's the possibility of an almost, I suppose, large increase of cancers into the future because they're not being diagnosed. And the remarkable thing is, with the e-referrals from GPs, some of the major cancer referrals are down over 50%. For example, breast cancer is down, I think, by 55% of actual referrals, and a whopping 72% decrease in e-referrals for skin cancer. Now, skin cancer, there's a number of types of skin cancer, but the melanoma is not a very nice cancer. And 72% decrease in GP e-referrals is a remarkable number by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, well, I'm the guy who doesn't know anything here. I'm Joe Public, really, and representing the people watching this who aren't scientists or medics or whatever. And I've got to try and ask the question that they might well ask you if they met you in the street. So, essentially what we have done, is it right? We have now done a trade-off. We have said, well, we can probably fix this COVID thing, but the price of fixing it is cancer. And then to take it on one step further, because we're hearing about domestic abuse and violence, we're hearing about mental problems, we're hearing about suicide and all these other things. Is that a good trade-off?
Well, it was a very bad trade-off. First of all, with any trade-off, you always have a cost-benefit analysis. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't one done whatsoever. If you go back to March, April, it was a new virus. It hit us. We locked down. It was probably the right thing to do. While we got a handle on the disease, while we sort of understood its epidemiology, while we knew how bad it was, for the very simple reason, some people closely associated with NPHET, we were getting enormously pessimistic predictions about mass deaths and whatever. Now, none of that ever materialized, obviously, but at the point of time, back March, April, it scared us. So we had to get a handle on this. We had to try to get our knowledge lined up in such a way that we could move forward. Now, we have moved forward as a people in the sense that we're aware now of the epidemiology of the disease. 4% of people died who contacted COVID way back in March, April. Now it's a fraction of 1%. It's 0.25% or less. And the reason for that is the virus remains the same. If you look down an electron microscope, it's the same virus, but the epidemiology is completely different. The population groups affected are completely different. Everything about this disease now is completely different, except our thinking. We've had no evolved thought, no evolved leadership in this whole area. And that worries me enormously because there are vast secondary casualties here in the form of cancer, not to mention cardiovascular cardiovascular disease, which hasn't been mentioned, and all the other types of.
I really don't want to put words in your mouth here, Dr. Carroll, but what you have said is our thinking hasn't evolved. But we have the same people clearly advising us through NPHET. Then isn't there a question to be asked by all of us that if there is no evolved, and every single person I am speaking to is saying that the position with COVID now is different from the position in COVID in March. Surely the position of our advisors should be different now from it was in March.
I would think so. I mean, I'm baffled why that's not so, because you have a running situation, a rapidly moving scenario here, and you have, I suppose, a very stagnant position point of view. And I frankly, as a medical doctor, I don't understand it. I mean, I haven't witnessed this before in any other scenario. Normally, within the world of medicine, you have healthy debate. Normally, you have views and ranges of points of view. You have scholarly articles, and eventually, you have an element of consensus. There's been none of this here, and you know, it is quite remarkable in that way, and I have very, very serious problems around all of this.
I mean, the British, I think it's fair to say, were bounced into lockdown in March because Imperial College said 800,000 people are going to die. I think we were bounced into lockdown in March because the modeler said 80,000 people are going to die. Now, that was monumentally wrong. If an economist had said, you know, there was going to be another 80,000 unemployed, he would have been questioned. If anybody in any field of endeavour, if somebody said it's going to be 80,000 more people in jails, in every other field of endeavour, they would have been questioned. Why? As a medical doctor, as an expert in public health, as a fellow of the Royal College of Tropical Medicine, Dr. Carroll, why is that?
Allow me to answer. First of all, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine. But
apologies.
Leaving that aside, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. But speaking now in a private and personal capacity, I mean, as a former public health doctor, as somebody who's involved as a senior medical officer in Ireland, in the HSE, in the Irish Health Service for many, many years, I mean, I can only presume that the medics, I mean, who generally work below the radar in public health, we're not a very visible bunch of people. But I would imagine that the medics clearly, I mean, have to give an element of advice. And if that advice is wrong, they'll be hung out to dry. So there's got to be an element of fear. Now, the politicians on their end, if they don't accept the medical advice, and if they're found to be wrong, they too will be hung out to dry. So from an electoral perspective, so this is driven by fear, a race to the lowest common denominator, to a lack of evolved thinking, to a complete lockdown scenario in which there is no opportunity for lateral thinking. There's no opportunity for any sense of there's a total failure to update. There's a failure to evolve. And we're getting trapped in our past decisions. And that's what strikes me as the nub of the issue.
It is hard for people listening, therefore, to listening to you and others, to have confidence in those who advise us, to have confidence in NPHET, in turn to give the advice to the government. Isn't it normal, if this weren't this pandemic and we needed doctors, if it was the Great Depression of the 1920s, or it was World War II, or any of the various things that have struck us in the last century or more, wouldn't the political class be making the decision? But here, isn't somebody else making the decision?
I suppose because there's an element of expert knowledge. And I mean, that knowledge is obviously from a very small pool of people. I mean, public health was always a very small sort of Cinderella aspect of the Irish Health Service anyway. So the pool of knowledge, the pool of expertise isn't really great. I mean, a case in point could be made to have maybe a peer review of some of the decision making. But that's another thing. Allow me to say, George, I was completely and totally supportive of NPHET. And my support continues on a point-by-point, case-by-case basis regarding their decision making. And in March and April, I was very, very supportive, as I too was trying to come to terms with what struck us as a very, very new scenario. Now, obviously, my confidence was completely placed in NPHET. I rode in, I did everything that obviously I was told to do and inform my patients, my colleagues, whoever else, and we were all under one hymn sheet on that one. But since then, a lot has changed regarding the virus, regarding its epidemiology, and I don't see change coming from the decision-making point of view. And
Right.
it's essential that public have confidence in decision-making.
Okay, let's talk about that finally with this question of confidence. If I decades ago, if my wife had been pregnant and morning sickness, I would have gone to some expert and he said, why don't you take this pill? This will be perfect. And then suddenly child is born with no arms and no legs, thalidomide. In this country, we are still suffering from the appalling decisions made in the cervical cancer issue. 221 women or more with tests that failed, 18 of them already dead. The swine flu fever, 80 cases before the court of children who will never be able to hold down a job, who are told this vaccine is safe. There's a great phrase that medics like to play God, but on this particular occasion, we have a right to question God.
We have a right to question the medics. I mean, we have a right to question everybody. We have a right to question me and to question anybody presenting a point of view. And I mean, I think that's the great thing about democracy, is the great thing about debate. We're all able to tease out the angles. Nobody has a monopoly on all wisdom, incidentally, although that may not be apparent by looking at pronouncements in this area.
All right, Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for joining me. GP, also as an expert in public health, and am I correct in saying Fellow of the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine?
Indeed you are, George.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure indeed. Thanks very much. Bye for now.